Hello and welcome to Let's Talk Automation. I'm Annalisa Camarillo. I am the Chief Marketing Officer at ISG Automation. We're going to talk a little bit about the myths in automation, several important questions that we continue to hear from our clients, as well as those that are talking about automation, AI, and several other topics, either through blogging or journalism or research. I am so happy to welcome Wayne Butterfield as my partner in this conversation today. Wayne is the global head of intelligent automation solutions at ISG and also an expert in this space. And so we're going to tap into his experience and his expertise as we have this conversation. Welcome, Wayne.
Thank you. Well, great to be here, Annalisa. Thank you for having me on the show. And I hope, at least, I am an expert and can provide some expert guidance.
Good. Well, we're going to put it to the test, right? And one of my first questions to you, to just help the audience understand your background, what is your experience with automation?
Okay, well, my youthful looks belie the fact that I've actually been doing this for about 12 years. And I first started in the world of RPA back in 2010. So it is well over a decade now, as I keep telling myself. I worked initially in industry. Clearly, I work in consulting now, but I worked initially in industry back in the UK, now based in Texas. But back in the UK, two of the biggest telcos over there, Telefonica and British Telecom. My background has generally been in operational efficiency and transformation. 2010, I had operationalized and gained as much efficiency as I think we could gain through process improvement at that point.
Right.
And I realized I needed to do something different. And RPA was that thing that was different. And so I spent the 4 or 5 years at Telefonica, probably as one of the first handful of people globally turning RPA into not just a technology, but into a capability within an organization that was able to transform our cost base. So lots of experience there. And then about 5.5 years ago, as the world of RPA started, everybody else started to catch up with what I had been doing. I made the move into consulting to help other organizations with my not made the same mistakes I did. And I'm very open about mistakes. It nearly got me fired twice. Lots of learnings and bumps along the road. But, I'm very happy to make those mistakes because it means that we're pushing boundaries. And because we push boundaries, because I push boundaries, it means that others are now able to benefit from this type of technology around the world.
And I couldn't agree more. One of the side gigs that I do is research and leadership and team performance, team development, all of those sorts of cool topics in this space called psychology, industrial and organizational psychology. And one of the biggest lessons is for people to get comfortable with errors, mistakes, falling down, right? Anything that, if we don't make mistakes, how do we grow, right? We learn from troubleshooting. And so I couldn't agree with you more that all those times that you may have done things wrong or learned something new in automation is another opportunity for us to grow and for you to share that information with anyone, right? And consulting, I can see how consulting really lets you do that. So thank you. That added a little bit of credibility to our conversation today. Let's dive into the myths. And one of the popular ones that I've heard and has been written about extensively is AI and RPA are the same thing. So if you're automating, and let me give this a little more context, right? If you're automating a business process end to end, and that business process has a lot of infrastructure underneath it, lots of application touch points, lots of different connectivity, interactions from different parts of the organization. Whether you automate it with AI or you automate it with RPA, it's the same thing. And I think fundamentally that is incorrect. What is your perspective on that?
Well, I would say that they are very, very different technologies. If you think about the definition of what AI is, it is the automation of any mental task. The reality is that RPA, if it's anything, it's probably not a mental task. It's probably the robotic side. It's everything but the mental task is how I would define it. And so anybody who is thinking about automation, it's not that you need to think about one or the other. You do need to think about both, but they are not interchangeable. They shouldn't be interchangeable. And the rationale for this is, I think, is very strong. The vast majority of work that we do does use the brain. It uses some form of intelligence. You know, whether we like it or not, most processes have been created with the human brain in mind. And why? It's because it's the greatest problem-solving capability that we have. There's no technology that, you know, even now can replicate the vast majority of the compute that our brains can deliver. An RPA certainly cannot replicate even a millionth of the compute that our brain has. Therefore, it cannot be seen as an AI capability. I would say that it absolutely isn't. It's almost the opposite of AI.
Right.
It doesn't mean that it's not useful. Really doesn't mean it's not useful. In fact, it is incredibly useful, right? Because if you think about the type of tasks that RPA is trying to automate, they are the ones that you can do when you're probably not thinking.
Right.
And that is a sure sign of something not
Right.
being AI, right?
Good point. Yeah, good point. Because, and that goes back to what you just said, when you're going to think about both, it's important to consider both types of technology in that process of determining what you want to automate. You're going to have those non-mental specific tasks, right? Those things that are not maybe as sophisticated. I'm going to use that word for lack of a better term. But you also have sophisticated processes that maybe do need much higher compute power, much more brain-like processing, if you will, right? And as you parse these out, you can determine, because it's an investment that you're going to make, right?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of investment do you want to make? And it's all going to be based on the importance and impact of those processes or those tasks that you're going to consider. So that makes complete sense to me, right? But I have heard them used interchangeably. Or here's where it gets even more confusing, is when you say intelligent automation through RPA, right? And now all of a sudden you've married intelligent with RPA, which I would think would only confuse the market even more.
Agreed. And that's in my job title, right? So I completely get that. The one other way maybe of being able to define this is RPA is very good at moving data, okay, from one place to another. That's what it does. It moves data. AI interprets data, makes predictions from data, does something with the data, right? So, you know, if you're just looking to move, you know, a information from a spreadsheet into an SAP, great. That's your kind of RPA side. If you're looking to interrogate data to find patterns, make predictions, etc., that's the world of AI. So that's the other way of what is it you're trying to do with data. And if it's just connect it, more likely RPA. If it's do something with it to get an answer, to get an outcome, probably going to be more AI.
I like that. I like that a lot. That completely simplified it down, at least for me. So give me an example of the two different tasks that you would do. What would be the use cases? So if I'm just looking to move data, what's a particular use case, you know, using an application as an example compared to what you would want to do with AI?
Yeah. I mean, finance is probably a great example of where there's a load of manipulation of data. It's some strange reason there's no system, it appears, in the world of finance that will ever give you the type of data you actually need. So what happens is you extract data from said system, you manipulate it into a different format, very repetitive, same format each and every month for, you know, a month-end closing. And then you might do something else with that data, put it into another system in order to close out month-end.
Yeah.
There is nothing but repetition, adding columns, removing columns, you know, very rules-based driven tasks. There is a mental side of that, but it's very repetitive. And so that's a pure RPA task. Now, if you wanted to look at predicting what your let's just say your orders are going to be for next month. So you are looking historically at data. You're looking at potentially third-party streams of information such as weather. If you think about, you're predicting the stock levels you need for ice cream, probably one of the data sources you're going to look at is both current and historical weather patterns in order to understand whether it's going to be warm or cold next month.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you start to think about when you're looking at data and you're doing something with it and you're making a prediction,
Mm-hmm.
I predict, or an AI predicts that the weather is 78% likely to be warm.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, as a result of that prediction, we now need to do something different with regards to stocking up ice creams.
Right.
That's the type of thing where we're looking at data, we're looking at historical data, and we're making a prediction moving forward. That's purely in the realms of AI.
Got it. And if we overlaid the business process that you just sort of described, a true AI solution would take it all the way to restocking that shelf accordingly, right? So even during some of the actions that have to take place.
Maybe I would actually say that once an AI has made that prediction, and you want to then do something transactional, you probably don't need AI at that point. You probably need RPA again.
Okay.
So, and a really good example, or a really good way to think about processes. And again, maybe we can talk about journeys later, but
Sure.
but processes. A process, usually you can break it down into an input. Mm-hmm. So there's a kickoff that may or may not need AI. Mm-hmm. There is often some kind of transactional activity that happens in the middle that may or may not need AI. And then there's an outcome and something that happens as a result, and that may or may not need AI. If you start to think about your processes in these three tranches, you can start to see certain processes which are the input is structured, the transaction is very rules driven, and the outcome is something that's also structured. That's RPA straight through.
Okay.
If the process is, let's say it's an email. So Annalisa, as an email comes in from a customer asking a question, that is not structured. We have no idea what that email is. Yeah. It's completely unstructured because we don't know at the point, we don't know what the question is. We don't know what their ask is. And we don't necessarily know what the process is that we're going to have to fulfill in order to answer that query. So unstructured start, that's AI. Now, AI may say this is an order. That may be very rules driven. That could be RPA.
Okay.
And the fulfillment, i.e. the email back to the customer, could also be very structured. Hi, Mr. Customer, your order has been placed. Here is your order number. Again, very, very structured. So it's RPA. So in that instance, you've got AI at the start, you've got RPA in the middle, and you've got RPA at the end. You would never be able to automate that process end to end using entirely RPA. I'm going to say ever. In theory, you could always try and hack anything, right? You could send a response back to the customer saying, thank you for your email. Can you please put it in this incredibly structured form so that I can get a very dumb bot to understand via drop downs whether or not what type of query you have. There's always a hack. The reality is you're putting it back on your customer to be incredibly structured because you haven't invested in an AI system. So if you think about, I try and simplify most things with kind of methods and methodologies, and I often try and think about input, action, output.
Yep.
And that's usually how you can define whether or not a process will or will not need AI involved in it, or whether or not it can, in theory, just be a straight through process with RPA. Now that's, again, we're thinking about a process here. Some people might say that that's quite a broad task. It's not necessarily an end-to-end journey,
right?
Which often might encompass multiple processes lumped together.
Multiple touch points is what I call it. Well, you've just simplified it by describing a couple of things that I think is important to just reiterate. So I like the framing that you said. When you're looking at a process, think about input, action, output, number one. Number two is it could include multiple types of automation, whether it be AI interpreting data in an unstructured set of tasks. Rules-based, it could be perfect for robotic process automation. And then depending on what you're trying to do at the output stage, if it's still interpretive or if it's more specific to just kind of moving data, as you said before, right? Then you still continue with RPA. But what you said there was to be able to do it with one or the other from end to end is almost not done today, or not a solution that could be necessarily provided today. And I may or may not be saying that correctly, but I think that's a perfect segue to the next myth, which is end-to-end automation exists. It is possible. And so let's talk a little bit about if we were using both AI and RPA in an ideal world where you do have this big, hairy process that touches multiple applications. Let's just take procure to pay as an example, right? Or, we'll take procure to pay because I can think of a number of other in the finance, right? In the financial services space that have, critical points throughout that process that could put your company at risk, could put your client at risk, right? How would you do it? How would we do end-to-end automation?
So how would we, how could we, or should we?
Right.
I think about those three things here. So how could we? I could define how we might do that. But it should we? Can we? I'm still kind of on the fence on a lot of this, and the reason being is when you think about procure to pay, like that is not a process for me. That's a journey, right? It's a journey, multiple touch points, multiple challenges, big challenges, right? Even if you think about the procure aspect of this, procurement, negotiation, pricing, purchase, all of that is kind of a big, hairy, fat problem right at the very start. We have entire departments called procurement whose role it is to do all of that for us. Procurement, I would say, ordinarily, certainly that negotiations aspect is not really a hotbed of great activity at the moment from an automation perspective. Having a great workflow is probably as kind of automated as we kind of are with that aspect of it right now. And what does that mean? Approvals, the right people being informed at the right times, workflow. That's what's going to make the process efficient.
Right.
I have seen, and I will admit, negotiation bots that are kind of in play. And what do I mean by that? Well, often contracts come up for renewal, and it might not necessarily be your big SAP contract that you want to renegotiate using the bot, but say it's your stationery, say it's your toilet roll, etc. I mean, all of these things are things that we have to procure still. So when you start to think about procurement, you obviously have your big meaty $1 million, $10 million, $100 million contracts.
Right.
You want a person involved in that. There's a load of stuff in your premise, your electricity bills, things like that you might want to negotiate, that people might want to negotiate with you about price rises and things. That there may well be a way that you can automate some of that so that your procurement people are spent where they're going to add the most value, which is saving 10% on a $100 million contract.
Right.
Not whether or not you can get an extra 30 loo rolls delivered every month for the same price. There's no value in that per se.
Right.
So again, depending on the size and scale of the negotiation, there may well be something. So you mentioned straight through end-to-end automation. I don't think we ever want to get to a point where a lot of processes are automated completely end-to-end because of the level of variation in both importance and the value that you can create by having people involved. So that's not to say that there are not, and there are some examples of, if we use procure to pay, and we'll use the stationery example, an end-to-end automation for that. Okay, there's a bot up front. It knows, okay, it's proactively going to the supplier. We need to, we're at the end of our 12-month contract. The current price is so-and-so. Our request, we're going to go to an RFI. Our request is that we're able to get 10% discount. Do you approve or not?
Right.
It's proactively going out and trying to negotiate with suppliers. It's not an overly complex thing. There might be a little bit of negotiation back and forth. There's an outcome at the end of that, which then kicks off a reasonably structured process. Okay, pricing, terms, whatever, few signatures. Again, it's all in a workflow. No person involved at any of that. There might be an approval stage, literally somebody ticking a box to say, yeah, good with this. And then, invoicing, so on. I mean, if we ignore the procure aspect and we get into the invoicing and pay, there's a lot of processes that have been automated across lots of organizations in this space.
Right.
Again, is it 100% straight through processing? No, I would say anybody who has markets a high percentage of straight through processing in the kind of procure to pay arena is it's probably not 100% being truthful. Invoices are semi-structured documents.
Right.
They are highly variable. Each supplier has their own.
Right.
It's very, very difficult from an automation perspective to get 100% straight through processing. If you had 70% straight through processing, I would say you do an incredible job, because there is just so much variation in this type of process.
Right.
And obviously, when you get to payments, setting up payments, reconciliations, etc., again, there's high levels of automation here. Your initial thing was, is there such a thing as straight through processing?
Right.
And I would say that there is opportunity, but it's never going to be 100%.
Yeah.
It's going to be very niche. But yes, absolutely, there is good opportunity to have some levels of end-to-end processing across customer journeys. We use procure to cash, hire to retire would be another one. And depending on the type of industry, client onboarding, annual service reviews, reports being produced, client offboarding, there are, depending on your industry, there are other ways of being able to automate entire journeys. We're just not mature enough yet as an industry, I would say, to have got the vast majority of organizations to that stage.
Mm-hmm.
I was a very, very, very early adopter. 10 years in, we've had ERPs, CRMs, and whatever else for 10, 20 years, right? They're still not automating end-to-end journeys. Like if we'd have believed the hype around the big ERPs and CRMs, previously, we shouldn't need automation because everything should be straight through processing, right? Yeah. It should be straight through processing. It's not. It's because every organization's different. Regulations by country are very different. There is a lot of variation in just about every single process known to man globally.
Right.
And so it's just not been that simple. But there are examples. We are growing, I would say, as an industry towards that type of thinking. And there will be the odd pocket of journey in certain organizations that will be highly automated with some level of straight through processing.
Do you have any examples of companies that are highly automated?
So I don't think there are loads of examples of companies that are highly automated. I think there's departments, I think there's certain journeys.
Right. Is the finance department becoming more automated? And that's such a general question to ask, right?
You would think if any department is going to be highlighted to be highly automated, it's got to be finance. Why? Because finance is in every organization. So I'm always asked, what are the hotbeds of activity of where automation should take place? The really simple answer is always finance. There's loads of opportunity in finance. It's true. There is loads of opportunity in finance. The issue with finance as a department, the benefit of finance as a department for where to concentrate is that organizations big and small will have a finance department, right? Organizations big and small may not have a logistics department. They may not have a customer onboarding. They may not have another department, right? Because they have a different industry, right? They're manufacturing or they're financial services, or they are in healthcare, pharma, you name it, right? But they all have a finance department.
Right.
And so when everyone says, where's the low-hanging fruit, blah, 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 everyone says finance, it's because every organization has a finance department. It's a very, very generic answer. The thing is, when you get into a finance department, especially one that's not huge, right? 20, 30, 40, 50 people, they are doing a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing a lot of different things in a certain way. There's lots of different departments. There is no truly defined process for how to do finance in any given industry, in any given country, right? There's so much variation there. And unless that department is massive, you're often not going to find, outside of a few examples, a big 10, 20 person process that is very transactional and is very easy to automate.
Right.
More often than not, even when you get shared services, and it's kind of like, hey, we've got 10, 20, 30 countries that we service. And I've got a great example here. I was working with a large manufacturing client in Europe, and they had 20 people doing a certain process in finance. The reality was that they were doing it in 30 different ways because they serviced 30 different countries. So it wasn't one process. It was actually 30 different processes. And so although it looked like 20 people were doing the same thing, the reality was that the biggest country had about 2.1 FTEs worth of effort associated to just their aspect of the process.
Wow.
And so that's the problem with a lot of finance departments, is that yes, there is opportunity, and yes, we could highlight 5 processes now where you're likely to see some kind of opportunity: reconciliations, invoice processing, those type, so there's always going to be some kind of reporting. There'll be something at month end, right? Potentially treasury, right? There's always opportunities in these areas, but is the opportunity, is it going to create a business case for you? And if your finance department's 10 people, then no, it's not, because those 10 people are actually going to do about 50 different things.
Yeah.
And that's the name of the game. Is there opportunity? Yes. Does it make a business case? Sometimes. Big organizations, yes. As you start to get into smaller organizations, I would say that opportunity starts to dwindle quite significantly because of the variation and the multiple roles that those finance professionals will complete over the stage of a month.
And I would think the best thing that a provider of automation can do is to consult the customer, the company, on how to prioritize where automation makes sense. Because to your point, there's a number of things to consider. As you said, in the procurement space, it's what's the contract value, right? Mm-hmm. Where do you really have the most pain? But even another question that pops up is, what is the risk of automating different parts of a whole process, right? Some you want to keep close to home, unless you're sure that it will automation can maintain the level of security that's required, right? And so I agree with you, especially now by the way that you've depicted this, that there are so many moving parts that it's hard to say end to end, right? Mm-hmm. And really it's how you rationalize where those opportunities are and what the maturity is in automation in those areas that you're going to determine by priority what makes most sense across a big, hairy process, right? Or even different fragments of that process, because it touches so many different parts of the business, or could impact so many different parts of the business. And then more importantly, the customer experience on the other side of that, right?
Yeah.
It brings me to another perfect segue, which is, so the business. One of the other promises of automation is that when you automate procurement or you automate invoicing, that now those people who can participate in automation and things can happen more easily, much faster, from the beginning of invoicing to, handing it off into a payment, right? It can evolve the business now. And so you've got this notion of citizen developers, or those people in the business that can now, really touch different aspects of an automated process and be involved. Is there really such thing as is that a promise that automation providers are delivering, this idea of a citizen developer? What are you seeing in that space?
I'm seeing loads of chatter, loads of talk. I don't always see loads of value be creative. Now, again, I think a lot of it comes down, and I've defined what a citizen developer is for me, and it's something I should really have dug out the definition before, but basically, it's a non-technical resource that is obviously somebody who is trained, on a given tool, is given time. So they're invested in, and I don't mean invested in by, from a monetary perspective, but time. Time is money, obviously, but they're given time, they're given support, and they're given license, right? They're given license to help their business deliver value, and that all is under a good framework, a good governance framework and an operating model like that. In a nutshell, for me, is what should define a good citizen developer program. The reality is that certain organizations have seen it as a cheap way to get developers. Okay, they've seen it as a cheaper way of trying to create value, so trying to use it as a bit of a shortcut. There's loads of stats flying around. I think the couple that I really appreciate from client discussions is that something like 80% of people trained in citizen developer programs will never develop more than one automation. now that for me is an issue. 3/4 of citizen developers feel that they are not given time in order to concentrate on them being a citizen developer. So that kind of issue around not investing time is obviously another big one. So two big stats there. You're not given enough time or support, and and as a result, people are not delivering value. And if you think about it, there's a cost associated with citizen developer as well. A license, you'll need a license to develop,
right?
And you'll need to be trained, right? So there is a cost there.
Right.
So if people are not delivering value, then you are creating a cost, versus creating value, and that for me is a big problem. But there are pockets of organizations that have done this incredibly well. There's a number of clients that I can't necessarily mention names of, but they've done it in different ways as well. So I think half the problem is the development side of this. And if you think about actually getting citizens to develop, these tools are no code, low code.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are easy for the wrong person to take and do something with. And what do I mean by that? Well, you kind of have to have an analytical mindset. You have to be very process orientated. You have to think about processes in logical steps. You have to be able to do all of that in order to take these tools and automate something.
Yeah.
Right. You can't just attack any process willy-nilly. You have to follow a process. You have to be able to follow a methodology. You have to be a bit of a problem solver. It's not always going to work necessarily right first time. You're going to have to think about maybe a touch of process engineering, because at the moment, the way that the process happens is not going to lend itself well to automation.
Right.
So, you have to have a certain mindset. One of the things that our clients have struggled with is finding those people. How do you find in the world of citizen, the world of employees, how do you find the people who are going to be good at this versus not?
Right.
And so, that's also a big challenge as well. This is not for everybody, and nor should it be, right? This, you shouldn't be expecting somebody who spent the last 30 years printing off their invoices, highlighting them with a highlighter, and then manually entering those digits in the system to suddenly be really motivated to automate. It's like they just have no interest, right? It's just not for them. So you need to find the right people who have the right skills, more importantly the right mindset, and support them, right? And if you get all of that right, there are loads of examples of where this has been incredibly good. I would say that 2/3 of citizen developer programs fall on the face. Without doubt. And so there are some, as I say, some sparking examples of where this has gone really well. And there's no two citizen developer programs I've seen that have ever been the same.
Yeah.
So there's always, a take on it. There's always a flavor on this. And I think that's kind of really important for anybody who is, thinking about this, is that, it's not necessarily a cookie cutter type approach. You really need to think about what are you looking to achieve, the type of organization that you are, type of software that you're making use of, what core capability you have within your organization. How much you're willing to invest in this, who you're going to work with to help support this, create a framework, et cetera, et cetera. There's loads of kind of things that you need to be considering in order to make this a success. And those that do really think about this and invest in this as a program, instead of seeing it as a cheap way to try and gain value, will be the ones that are more successful. Not guaranteeing success, but will be more successful. So yes, lots of organizations are talking about it. Some of them have been really successful, but there's lots of organizations where this just hasn't quite worked for them.
Yeah, and I consider that some really good advice and context for why this might be more hype than practice. And that's what I think is important, is to describe, in practice, not in theory, how do you do something like this so that you can benefit from it? I mean, the headline is, our tools are so easy. Automation tools are code-free and so easy that even, you can even enable citizen development, right? I mean, and that's the headline. When in reality, there's a whole lot of investment that needs to happen above and beyond just buying an automation solution for you to reap those benefits, right? And I just think it's those little details, right? The fine print is what unfortunately is missed in the way that we promote and communicate and tell the story around the benefits with automation. And so I think that was super helpful. And I even feel like I understand what's really possible where that's concerned, and I'm in automation, right? But as we consult clients, customers that want to get into this space, I think really depicting the truth around what is needed, right, it is really going to be key to their success. So yeah, I think that was super helpful advice. Turning to the last topic here, because we've covered a lot of ground. How is automation, and this is tied to what we just talked about. So how does automation change the way people work? I had a conversation in my last podcast about the people factor in automation. So we're talking about how it's not as easy as it may seem. It takes a lot of skills. It takes participation from the whole company. It takes investment. And no one company is the same, right? So there is no one size fits all for something that you may think is common, like a procure to pay process. I mean, that was, I think, one of the key points that you made is, even though we may think procure to pay, it happens all the same way. It's not true, because every company's DNA, every blueprint is different, right? So who does what, and even the way that those different steps take place are going to be unique to that particular company, either because of their industry or because of how much money they make or how they're structured, right? It all depends. And so the same is true, obviously, for how people work. And top question we've gotten is, are there different skills required when your IT team, right? There may be a new automation department. There may be a new RPA department. How does it change the way people work?
Cool. I look at this through a few different lenses, to be honest. My background historically was in kind of contact center transformation. And one of the things I defined many moons ago, it seems, was kind of, what does the future of the contact center look like? And, how is automation changing the role of the contact center agent? And, it doesn't have to be contact center, but, there was kind of three roles that I felt would be created as a result of automation. And it's got nothing to do with the COE. It's actually as a result of the outcomes of automation. So the first kind of thing, role type is, automation is going to remove the simple stuff, right? It is, and it has been. It's been removing the simple stuff, the stuff that you can do, as I mentioned earlier on, without thinking, right? So what that leaves is the more complex stuff. And we're already seeing this, right? I've worked with clients before, and they've they're actually seeing an increase in the amount of time that work is taking. They're like, I thought automation was supposed to reduce our average time. It's like, well, no, what automation's done is it's taken away all of this simple stuff. It's left all of the complex stuff. And so the complex stuff is and always has taken longer to complete. It's just that you've had it diluted with the simple things that, you know, you can do in 2 minutes. So those things that take 10 minutes, your average is only 5-6 minutes. The reality is you've always had those 10-minute tasks. Now you just have more of them because all the simple stuff is removed. Okay, so the first thing is dealing with those exceptions. You know, I just called it the exception handler. Basically, automation takes all the simple things. The things that are left are the things that you really need problem-solving abilities for.
Yeah.
So how's automation going to change work? Well, the first thing is it's probably going to leave you with a more complex job. It's going to leave you with a more complex role. Because, if we think about straight-through processing, or even think about the procurement example that we did before, all those toilet roll, stationery, gas and electric utility, negotiations, they're all automated.
Yeah.
And so you are now left with a really complex 6,000-page contract that you have to negotiate with a big, huge technology provider. Your role has changed. As that procurement lead, you are only dealing with the complex stuff. Likewise, the contact center is exactly the same as is back office. That loan application that spat out as an exception because the person has only recently moved from the country that they were in, but the reality is that they are a millionaire. And so, they don't have a credit rating, but actually if we were to look at their finances, then we can make a decision. Now, we might not necessarily want an AI or an automation to make that decision because it's an exception, right? Not everybody who moves from another country, has, $1 million in the bank, right? But that's an exception. And therefore, somebody is going to have to make, they're going to have to do an investigation. They're really going to have to look. They're going to have to speak to somebody. You cannot automate that necessarily, at least not for now. So you're going to be dealing whatever shape and form of role that you have, you're going to be dealing with more and more exceptions. And exceptions just require problem solving ability. And so that's one of the areas. So the exception handler. And then the other side of that, potentially, if we think about more the technology side, is the citizen developer, perhaps the core automation capability. Their role is really going to be, once most things are automated, trying to capture more and more of those exceptions within the core automation, right? So that's kind of what they're doing. You've got somebody dealing with the exceptions over here, and you've got these guys over here who are looking to try and capture as much of that new stuff as possible, so that more can be straight through processing. Right. So you can have people who are going to be dealing specifically with exceptions, as in trying to automate more of them, and then the problem solvers who are going to have to be dealing with them until they are automated. Again, two kind of completely separate roles to what we have at the moment. Multitasking, and not just multitasking, but multidiscipline. Yeah. So again, if you think about processes with SLAs, if you think about contact centers with opening hours, you need what's called a critical mass. And what do I mean by that? You need to have enough people in a given department across an opening window, across different days, so that when your customer phones, emails, texts, or whatever, there's somebody there.
Yeah.
Right? Now, if you had a department of 100 and you're open 24/7, 365 days a year, and you've automated all the simple stuff, and there's only 30 of you now, you're going to be working a lot of hours, or you're going to have to do something different as an organization in order to still have that window of opening and have people man it. Now, it might be that you've got 3 departments like that. You've got a fraud contact center over here. You've got a new provisions, new orders. You are literally going to have to crumple your critical mass together in order to stay open for that operating window. Now, what does that mean for the employee? That now suddenly means that they don't need to be a fraud expert. They need to be a fraud expert, a new connections expert, an anti-money laundering expert, you name it. They're suddenly going to have a multidiscipline knowledge Now that makes it incredibly difficult. I don't need to just be an expert in one area. I now need to be an expert in 10 areas. Okay, now, again, that's what automation is potentially going to do, but also automation can help. So, you're not just going to give and expect the human retention of knowledge to suddenly increase tenfold, right? So you're going to have to help them with, actual desktop assistant, virtual assistants, natural language processing assistants in the IVR, things that are going to provide you the answers as much as possible. So again, you're going to change the way that you approach. You're going to be asking questions of the customer, and then AI is actually going to be finding and presenting the answers to you. So you're actually going to become more of an investigator on the phone, but you're going to have support. So you don't necessarily need to know the answers. You just need to know the right type of questions that you're going to be asking. And the reason being is you're going to spell those things out, because the clearer you spell those out, the easier it's going to be for an automation to find you an answer. And so again, that's really different to today.
Right.
We on the end of the phone at the moment are expected to find the answer and to present the answer. What we're going to change into is a role where we're going to be asking the right questions. Someone's going to give us the direction that they need to go in, and then an automation, an AI in this instance rather than RPA, is generally going to provide us and present us with the insight and the knowledge that we need in order to assist that customer. And why? It's because I'm not just having to now understand 5 things. I'm now going to have to understand 50 things, and I'm not going to be able to be trained on those 50 things. And I've always said, to be honest, for a number of years now, the winners and losers of business in the future are not going to be those that use technology, all the technology. It's going to be those who can marry technology and their people together in order to find the right outcomes for their customers, their clients, etc. And I've shown slides in the past where it's like the agent of the future is a cyborg. There's nothing physically implanted in them, but they are using technology to their advantage. They are using it to augment their own ability to serve. Right. And that is going to be where we move in the future. And that is how automation is going to really change the way that we work. We are truly going to be assisted by technology as opposed to use it as a means to an end at the moment. Things like Alexa for work.
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect example. And I will say, while for some of our listeners that might seem intimidating, right? The change, the fact that now you may have to be more of a generalist than a specialist, and there's more information that you have to know. I actually think it's incredibly exciting too, to think that we can clear off the desk of the less strategic, more creative, more problem-solving types of tasks, spend more time learning and using our experience and our background to do those more sophisticated things, armed with the tools, with the education, with the technology, with all of those things, training or that whatever it may be, which is actually going to be a new important problem for the HR teams in these companies to solve, right? If it really is an investment that a company is going to make all the way around, they know that this transition has to happen, and they address it in the people, in the process, and in the technology, versus just adopting a solution and thinking the rest is just going to fall into place, right? I think that's an incredibly exciting opportunity for humanity in general, right? This idea that now you're going to be armed with the information that you need to be successful, but you're going to use all of your most sophisticated faculties, right, to change the world, to help customers do things better, faster, to reinvent your industry, to be a better relationship manager and builder, right, to use all of those things that I think are inherently more fun to do, right? But to your point all along, it's not easy. And like we typically do in business, we sell the dream, right? And I think we've depicted what that dream looks like to some extent, right? With the right kind of calculated steps taken by every company to invest in those areas, people, process, and the technology, when they're properly married and you have a true kind of sustainable program that helps you do automation better, I think there is going to be incredibly successful, beneficial change that companies will experience when they go down that path. And I think that's awesome.
Me too.
So with that, Wayne, I think we've covered so much ground. What I'd like to do now is just say thank you to you, say thank you to our listeners. Let's just go ahead and call this a wrap. Thank you to everybody for listening in to Let's Talk Automation. You're going to get a full copy of this podcast and video discussion at your disposal. So thank you to you, Wayne, and it's a wrap.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Annalisa. Really appreciated your time and those great questions.
Thanks.